Welcome back to the archive. I'm Paul, and today I want to start with something you've never thought about. When did you last go a full day without money? Not without spending money, without thinking about it, without checking your balance, without calculating whether you could afford something, without money somewhere in the back of your mind, measuring, comparing, weighing. You probably can't remember, because money is not just in your wallet, it's in your head. It's the operating system through which you understand your place in the world. But here is the record that stops me every time I sit with it in this archive. For most of human history, money was not the operating system. Most people who ever lived went entire lifetimes thinking about money the way you think about sailing ships. It existed somewhere for other people. In England, in the year 1300, a typical village craftsman might handle fewer than 12 coins in an entire year. 12. Not 12 a day, not 12 a week, 12 in a year. And he was not poor. He was a respected member of his community. He had food, he had shelter, he had a trade. He had something more valuable than money. He had obligations. If you're new to this archive, welcome to Paul's Lost Knowledge Empire. Subscribe before we go further. What we find here, you won't find summarized anywhere else. Let's open the record.
Every record in this archive tells two stories: the story of what happened and the story of what was already there when it happened. To understand what money did to medieval society, you have to understand the world it replaced. England, 1270. There was a man I keep returning to in this archive. His name was Thomas, a blacksmith, in a village somewhere in the English Midlands. Not famous, not remarkable. A craftsman who made and repaired the metal things that held a village together: plows, horseshoes, door hinges, locks, knives, nails. Thomas's forge was the most important building in the village after the church. And yet Thomas almost never touched a coin. Here is how his week looked. On Monday, his neighbor William brought a plow blade that had cracked over winter. Thomas repaired it. William said nothing about payment. Thomas said nothing about payment. At harvest time, William would bring 2 bushels of grain to Thomas's door. No invoice, no receipt, just grain. On Wednesday, the miller's horse threw a shoe on the road outside the village. Thomas reshod the horse. The miller said nothing about payment. For the next month, the miller ground Thomas's grain at no charge. On Friday, Thomas spent the morning working on the Lord's fences. He didn't choose to do this. This was his obligation. 3 days of labor a week on the Lord's land, in exchange for the strip of land Thomas's family farmed. Not slavery, not exactly freedom, an obligation. And on Sunday, Thomas's wife Agnes sold 2 jugs of ale she had brewed during the week to the men who gathered after church. Not for coins, for credit. Marks on a tally stick kept behind the church door. This was not a primitive economy. It was a different economy, with different logic, different strengths, different failures. And it worked, for most people, in most villages, for most of the Middle Ages.
I want to stay in Thomas's village for a moment longer, because there is someone else in this record who the archive almost missed. Her name was Agnes, Thomas's wife. And Agnes, in the economy of the village, was arguably more powerful than Thomas. Not more respected, not more visible, more powerful. Here is what Agnes did. Every week, she malted barley, mashed it with hot water, fermented it, and produced ale. Not wine, not spirits. Ale. Weak, cloudy, slightly sour, the drink that every person in the village consumed every single day, because the water was not safe. Agnes sold this ale to her neighbors, not for coin, for marks on a tally stick. A tally stick was a piece of wood split down the middle. Agnes kept one half, the customer kept the other. Every notch cut across the split represented a jug of ale. When the tally was settled, both halves matched or they did not. There was no way to cheat the tally. The wood itself was the record. And Agnes was the keeper of the records for half the village. John the farmer, 3 jugs this week. William the miller, 2 jugs in a dispute about whether he'd paid for last Tuesday. The Lord steward, 6 jugs, always on credit, always eventually paid. Agnes knew who was flush and who was struggling. She knew whose harvest had been good and whose cow had died. She knew which families were building up debt and which were paying it down. She knew things about the economy of the village that no one else knew. Not the priest, not the Lord, not Thomas. And she used this knowledge carefully. When a family was in trouble, Agnes extended credit, quietly, without announcement, more notches on the tally. When a man was drinking too much, Agnes slowed the notches, not dramatically, just slower. This was not written down anywhere. It was not a policy. It was judgment. The judgment of a woman who understood the financial state of her community better than anyone else alive in it. The alewife, this figure who appears in medieval records mostly as a minor character, often a comic one, was in practice one of the most important economic institutions in the English village. For 3 centuries, from roughly 1200 to 1500, brewing and selling ale was primarily women's work. Not exclusively, but primarily. And then, as the money economy grew, something changed. Brewing became profitable. When ale could be sold for coin, real coin, market coin, it stopped being domestic work and became a trade. And trades in the medieval world were organized into guilds. And guilds in most English towns did not admit women. Within a generation, the alewife disappeared from most English towns, replaced by the male brewer, the professional, the guild member. The tally sticks were burned or lost. The records Agnes kept in her head, who owed what to whom, who needed help, who could be trusted, those records died with the women who held them. I keep returning to this in the archive, not because it is only Agnes's story, because it is the story of what happens when an economy changes and the people who made the old one work are not invited into the new one. Agnes was not replaced because she was doing something wrong. She was replaced because what she was doing became valuable enough for someone else to take. That is the record.
The word debt in the Middle Ages did not mean what it means today. Today, debt is a number, a specific sum, a legal obligation, something that follows you from creditor to creditor, from court to court, across your entire life. In 1270, debt was a relationship. Thomas owes me did not mean Thomas owes me 4 pence. It meant Thomas and I are bound. We are connected. I have a claim on his future, and he has a claim on mine. The village ran on these claims. There were 3 forms of what we might call payment, though none of them felt like payment at the time. The first was grain. Grain was the universal currency of the village. When the Lord collected his dues, he collected grain. When the church took its tithe, it took grain. When neighbors settled accounts, they settled in grain. A good year meant surplus grain. Surplus grain meant security. Not savings, security. The difference matters. Savings sit in a box. Security lives in relationships. The second was labor. The most common form of exchange in medieval England was not grain, not coin, it was the body. Your time, your strength, your skill applied to someone else's problem. When Thomas reshod the miller's horse, he was not performing a transaction. He was depositing into a relationship. When the whole village gathered to help a neighbor build a barn, no money changed hands, but something more durable was created. The third was beer. I want you to take this seriously. Beer was not a luxury in medieval England. It was a nutrient. Water was often unsafe to drink. Beer, weak beer, low alcohol, was what people drank instead of water. Agnes brewed it, and Agnes selling it was not a small thing.
For many women in medieval villages, brewing and selling ale was one of the very few ways to participate meaningfully in the local economy. The alewife, the woman who brewed and sold ale, was a figure of economic power in ways the record rarely acknowledges. She kept the tally, she extended credit, she decided who was good for a debt and who was not. In many villages, the alewife knew more about the financial state of the community than anyone else, including the Lord. Now, the system existed. Grain and labor and beer and obligation, a web of relationships that held the village together without a single coin changing hands. And the church, which watched everything, had strong opinions about it. Specifically about one thing: usury, lending money at interest. The church declared usury a mortal sin, not a minor transgression, a mortal sin, the kind that sent you to hell if you died without repenting. Why? Because charging interest transformed debt from a relationship into an extraction. If Thomas borrowed grain from William and returned the same amount at harvest, that was a relationship. William helped Thomas through a hard time. Thomas honored his obligation. The bond between them was strengthened. But if William lent Thomas grain and demanded more grain back, if William profited from Thomas's hardship, that was something else. The church called it the selling of time. Because interest is the price of waiting, and time, the church argued, belongs to God. You cannot sell what is not yours. This was not only theology, it was a defense of the system, a defense of the idea that debt is a bond, not a commodity. But here is the record that makes this complicated. The church's prohibition applied to Christians. And Jews, excluded by law from most professions, barred from owning land, forbidden from joining guilds, were left with the financial trades that Christians were not supposed to touch. Not because they chose it, because every other door was closed. A man named Aaron of Lincoln, a Jewish moneylender in 12th century England, became one of the wealthiest men in the country. He lent to kings, he lent to monasteries, he financed the building of 9 Cistercian abbeys and the monastery of St. Albans. When Aaron died in 1886, his debts owed to him were so vast that the crown created a special department of the treasury just to collect them, the exchequer of the Jews. The church forbade usury, the economy needed it, and the people who provided it paid a price for doing so that the records rarely calculate. The first record I want to show you is not about coins or grain. It is about something harder to see. What the economy of trust actually provided that money cannot. Thomas, the blacksmith, had no savings, no pension, no insurance policy, no safety net in any form we would recognize today. And yet, Thomas was not unprotected. If Thomas's forge burned down, the village rebuilt it, not because they were paid, because Thomas was in the web, because his obligations ran in all directions, and obligations run both ways. If Thomas fell ill for a month, his neighbors brought food, not charity, payment of a debt so old and so diffuse that no one could have named it. If Thomas's daughter needed a husband, the network found one. The web of relationships that Thomas had spent his life building was the infrastructure of his existence. This is what I keep returning to in the archive. We think of the medieval peasant as desperately vulnerable, and in many ways he was. Famine, plague, the Lord's arbitrary cruelty. But inside the village, inside the web, there was a kind of security that the money economy has never fully replaced. The economist Karl Polanyi called it embedded economy, an economy embedded in social relations rather than social relations embedded in an economy. The difference is not abstract. In an embedded economy, you cannot be foreclosed on by a stranger. You cannot be evicted by a calculation. The people who hold your debts are also the people who will help you when your roof falls in. Thomas understood this.
not as a theory, as the air he breathed. If you've been walking through this archive with me, thank you, genuinely. Choosing to understand the mechanism rather than just the surface story, that's what this archive exists for. If you haven't subscribed to Paul's Lost Knowledge Empire yet, this is the moment. There is much more here, and we are only getting started.
The second record is about an arrival. Not a sudden arrival, a slow one. The kind you don't notice until it is already everywhere. 3 forces brought the coin into Thomas's world. The first was war. Kings fought, and wars cost money. Not grain, not labor, money. To pay soldiers, you needed coin. To buy weapons, you needed coin. To move armies across distances, you needed coin. So kings taxed, and increasingly, they taxed in coin. Not in grain, not in days of labor, in coin. Which meant that Thomas, who had never needed a coin, now needed to find one. Which meant going to market, which meant selling something, which meant entering the money economy, whether he wanted to or not. The second force was the plague. After the Black Death of 1347, which killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population, the survivors found themselves with something new: leverage. There were more farms than farmers, more lords than laborers. For the first time in centuries, the ordinary worker could make demands. Some demanded higher wages, some demanded payment in coin rather than in obligation. The lord of one English manor recorded his frustration in 1360. The villagers will not work for their customary services. They demand to be paid in silver or they will leave. Silver. The old web was beginning to fray. The third force was the market town. As towns grew, as trade routes expanded, as merchants began moving between villages rather than living inside them, a new kind of person appeared in Thomas's world. A person with no obligations to him. A person who did not know his grandfather. A person who would sell him nails for a halfpenny and be gone by morning. This person dealt only in coin. And slowly, Thomas had to learn to deal with him. He met this person in the figure of Richard, a traveling ironmonger who passed through the village twice a year with better quality nails than Thomas could make himself. Richard didn't want grain. Richard didn't want ale credit. Richard wanted a halfpenny. Thomas had to find a halfpenny. This was new. This was uncomfortable. This was the beginning of the end of the old world.
Now the coin was needed. The king's tax collector had come through the village in October, not asking for grain this year, asking for coin. A halfpenny per household. New policy. Non-negotiable. Thomas had no halfpenny. He had grain, he had horseshoes, he had obligations owed to him by half the village, but he had no halfpenny. Which meant, for the first time in his life, Thomas had to go to market. The nearest market town was 6 miles away, a walk of 2 hours each direction. Thomas had been to the market perhaps 4 times in his life, always with his father, always to sell surplus iron, always returning with grain or a specific tool he could not make himself. He had never gone to find a coin. He left before dawn, carrying 3 horseshoes he had made during the week. Good work, solid iron, the kind of horseshoes that would last 3 seasons. The market was already loud when he arrived. Not a village gathering, a machine. Dozens of stalls, sellers shouting prices, buyers moving fast, comparing, calculating. No one knew Thomas here. In the village, Thomas's name was his credit. The sound of his hammer was his reputation. Everyone knew his father and his grandfather and the quality of their work. Here, Thomas was nobody. A man with 3 horseshoes and no idea what they were worth in coin. He found a farrier's stall, a man selling horseshoes,
mass-produced, slightly thinner than Thomas's, slightly cheaper. Thomas showed his horseshoes. The farrier looked at them, offered a farthing for all three. A farthing, a quarter of a penny for 3 horseshoes that had taken him a full day to make. Thomas said nothing. He didn't know if this was fair. He had no reference point. In the village, fair was what the relationship determined. Here, fair was what the market said. And the market was saying, a farthing. He took it. He found a money changer at the edge of the market, explained that he needed a halfpenny. The money changer gave him a halfpenny in exchange for the farthing and 2 iron nails Thomas had in his pocket. Thomas stood outside the market, holding a halfpenny. He had never held one before, not like this, not one he had earned. It was smaller than he expected, lighter. 2 hours' walk home, 6 miles, 1 halfpenny. He gave it to the tax collector the following week, without ceremony. The collector made a mark in his ledger, didn't look up. Thomas walked back to his forge. He thought about what 3 horseshoes were worth in the village. In the village, 3 horseshoes meant a winter's worth of bread from the miller, or 6 months of ale credit from Agnes, or a favor from the Lord's steward that could matter enormously at the wrong moment. In the market, 3 horseshoes were a farthing. He wasn't sure the market was wrong. He was sure that something had been lost in the translation. Something that didn't have a name yet. Something that the records from this period almost never mention, because the people keeping the records were the people for whom the coin was not a strange new thing. But for Thomas, standing outside a market, holding a halfpenny, the world felt different than it had that morning. Smaller, more precise, and somehow, despite the coin in his hand, slightly less secure.
The third record is the one I find most quietly devastating. It is about what happens when a relationship becomes a number. In Thomas's world, a debt was personal. I owe William 2 bushels of grain was a statement about Thomas and William. It could not be transferred. William could not sell that debt to a stranger. A court could not enforce it against Thomas's children. It lived and died with the relationship. When Thomas died, his obligations largely died with him. His son inherited the forge. He did not inherit the debts. He began building his own web from the beginning. In the money economy, debt is a number. Numbers can be transferred. Numbers can be sold. Numbers can be collected by people who never knew you. Numbers do not forget. Numbers do not forgive. By the late 14th century, English courts were increasingly dealing with debt cases between people who had never met. A merchant in London had bought a debt owed by a farmer in Yorkshire to a trader in Bristol. The farmer had never heard of the London merchant. The London merchant had never heard of the farmer. But the number was real, and the court enforced it. This is the moment the old economy ended. Not with a revolution, not with a proclamation, with a court case in which 2 strangers argued about a number that had once been a relationship between neighbors. Thomas's grandson, also a blacksmith, also in the Midlands, understood this new world in a way his grandfather never had to. He kept written records. He charged set prices. He collected coin. And when a bad winter came and the harvest failed, and he could not pay the merchant he owed, the merchant sent a letter. Not a neighbor, a letter, demanding payment, in coin, by a specific date. Thomas's grandfather had never received such a letter in his life, because in his world there was no one to send it.
Let me take you to the last room in this section of the archive. The room where all 3 records are laid out together, side by side. England, 1270. Thomas the blacksmith. 12 coins in a year. A web of obligations that protected him,
connected him, made him real in the life of his village. And 3 mechanisms activate. First, the economy of trust, not a primitive system, a different system, one where debt was a bond, not a number, where your creditors were also your neighbors, your protectors, your community, where you could not be ruined by a stranger with a letter. Second, the coin arrives, not invited, through war, through plague, through the traveling merchant who wanted a halfpenny and would not take grain. Each transaction in coin was a small withdrawal from the web of obligations. Each withdrawal made the web a little thinner. Third, debt becomes a number that can be sold, a number that can be collected by someone who never knew you, a number that does not care about your sick wife or your burned barn or your bad harvest, a number that goes to court. None of this was planned. No philosopher designed it. No king decreed it. No merchant sat down one morning and decided to destroy the economy of trust. It happened in 10,000 small decisions, each one rational, each one reasonable, each one another thread pulled from the web. And Thomas's grandson woke up in a world his grandfather would not have understood, a world where you could owe a debt to someone you had never met, where your obligations could be bought and sold like grain, where what you were worth was a number, not a name. Progress? Perhaps. The money economy created things the old system never could: cities, trade, accumulation, the material world we live in today. But it also created something else, the possibility of being completely alone in your debt. I leave that record open for you to read yourself.
That is what the archive held today. Not a story about the invention of money, a story about a blacksmith who was rich without a coin to his name, and about what happened to that richness when the coin arrived. About a system of obligations that held villages together for centuries and dissolved not because it failed, but because something faster came to replace it. And underneath Thomas's story, other stories. Agnes at her ale vat, the most financially informed person in the village, whose name the records almost never kept. Aaron of Lincoln, who financed 9 abbeys for a church that called his trade a sin. And Thomas's grandson, opening a letter from a stranger in London asking for coin, by a specific date. If this changed the way you see something, share it with one person. That is how this archive grows. And if you haven't subscribed to Paul's Lost Knowledge Empire yet, the doors are open. Every record we open here pulls back the cloak on how things really worked, underneath the version we were taught. Next time, I'll take you to a different shelf entirely. The archive never runs out of records. I'm Paul, archivist of Paul's Lost Knowledge Empire. Stay curious and keep reading.